Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Professor Marc-William Palen as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Marc-William Palen is an associate professor of history at the University of Exeter, Department of Archaeology and History, and a member of the Center for Imperial and Global History. His research traces how trade, economic ideology, and foreign policy shaped the rise and rivalry of the British and US empires from the mid-19th century onwards, with particular attention to political economy, gender, humanitarianism, and ideology in global imperial expansion. He is the author of Pax Economica, Left-Wing Vision of a Free Trade World, published by Princeton University Press, a prize-winning study of global capitalism, anti-imperialism, and peace activism, and of the conspiracy of free trade, published by Cambridge University Press, which examines Anglo-American struggles over empire and economic globalization. Professor Mark is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Higher Education Academy and co-directs the Global Economics and History Forum in London. His commentary on historical and contemporary global affairs has appeared widely in international media, and he edits the Imperial and Global Forum, the center's flagship blog. Trained at the University of Texas at Austin and formerly based at Tufts University, the University of Sydney, and several leading research libraries and institutes, he brings a deeply transnational perspective to the histories of empire, capitalism, and global order. In today's episode, Professor Marc-William Palen joins us to unpack the central ideas from his acclaimed book, Pax Economica, Left-Wing Visions of a Free Trade World. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marc-William Palen to the conversation. Professor Mark, it is a distinct privilege to welcome you to the Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you for the invitation and for that gracious introduction.
Thank you. Professor, free trade today is usually framed as a right-wing or neoliberal project. What first led you to surprising realization that many of its earliest and most passionate advocates were on the left? And what misconception about globalization did you most want this book to overturn?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think one of the things that one of the ways that I came at this originally was from this growing body of scholarship on neoliberalism, this right-wing conservative kind of Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman's and the Mont Pelerin Society coming into being in the 1930s, 1940s, and then taking over the Western-dominated institutions that oversaw trade liberalization across the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And while I found a lot of that persuasive, what it didn't reflect was this other left-wing story that I was starting to see when I was writing the first book, which is focused mainly on the late 19th century free trade movements in the United States, but what quickly became the history of the U.S. peace movement and the U.S. anti-imperialist movement in surprising ways. And then as I started following that story even further into the 20th century, the ways that this left-wing story of free trade and peace and anti-imperial activism, this kind of left-wing advocacy of globalization, was played a very important and I think overlooked part in the creation of the post-1945 liberal or rules-based world order that is often, I think, mostly given credit to the neoliberal side of that story. And so this is a very different one that I think connects in interesting ways with questions of decolonization and so forth that start becoming much bigger issues across the 20th century as well. What misconception about globalization did so I think a big part of this is to recover this very, I think, rich left-wing story of globalization and peace and anti-imperial activism that I think played a very, very important role in shaping the international system that until recently has been a part of our lives, and that this isn't just a right-wing story, it is a left-wing story too.
Professor, you recover a wide ecosystem of left-wing free traders, from liberal radicals and socialist internationalists to feminist and Christian pacifists. Could you walk us through a concrete example of how one of these groups linked free trade to peace, social justice, and anti-imperialism in practice?
Hmm. Um, I think probably focus in on the feminists for this. Because I think it doesn't. It was at first one of the trickier ones that I came across to try to figure out the connection between women's suffragism and free trade activism. But once I think I had unpicked that puzzle, I thought that this one became a good one. And so this just like many of the stories in this book, it begins in the mid 19th century. This is when the international free trade movement starts picking up pace once Britain turns to free trade in the 1840s. Um, but also the ways that this free trade movement and the way it connected itself to peace and democratization through, in the case of Britain, right, it was undermining uh, the economic influence of the aristocratic landed elites who were making lots of money off of protectionism and making Britons buy expensive food made by and grown by these aristocratic landowners rather than getting cheaper food from all over the world. So already you're starting to see within the British case of the 1840s and 50s this connection between um, undermining the political influence and economic influence of aristocratic landed elites, which would then democratize British politics more and create a more food secure world, at least for the British in this context. But they thought that this could be then exported to countries around the globe. And so within this, you start to see the way that this starts moving around the same circles as the abolitionist movement, freeing mankind from the shackles of real human bondage was, they thought, reflective also of the ways that high tariff policies of these aristocrats shackled consumers. And so for them, these were two sides of the same coin. And within that, you start to see the beginnings of the women's suffrage movement, what will become the first wave of women's suffrage by the time we get to the early 20th century. It's also coming into being slowly within this abolitionist and free trade movement and peace activism of the mid 19th century that continues to grow as I trace and becomes more and more anti-imperial. And so by the time we get to where we commonly think of the women's suffrage movement starting to pick up pace, especially transatlantic women's suffragism in the early 20th century, you start to see a really fascinating confluence of all these movements taking shape, and the way that women suffragists who were seeking the right to vote really latched onto this democratization aspect of free trade that had been growing across this period, as well as the food security aspect. So when we get to the First World War, you start to see the women's suffrage movement become the leaders of the international women's peace movement that becomes one of the most influential women's peace movements of the interwar years. And for them, even more than their male counterparts, it's this connection to democratization and it's this connection to ending world hunger that becomes so crucial because they see women and children who have no real voice in whether a country goes to war or not, them being the ones that suffer the most from wars. And so if you can create a more peaceful, more food secure world, this will in turn allow for a greater promise of democratization and giving a voice to women in politics and kind of mutually reinforcing in that way.
Professor, in the book, you contrast the familiar story of gunboat, imperial free trade, with a very different tradition of economic pacifism. How did left-wing free traders argue that dismantling tariffs and empire could actually reduce the likelihood of war, and what did their critics miss about this vision?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think this in certain ways is in international relations scholarship what some call capitalist peace theory or commercial peace theory or interdependence theory. This kind of well accepted theory at this stage within political science of how the more interconnected nations become through trade, the less likely they are to go to war with one another. Why do you need necessarily go to war with one another if you can just trade freely for the things that they have that you want, and vice versa? This was an idea, though, that was really picking up pace by the mid 19th century, and in no small part because of uh, uh, gunboat diplomacy, mainly, most famously being practiced by the British, right? So this is one of those things where you have the opium wars of the mid 19th century, where Britain coercively opens up the markets of China to import opium from India. And often in the you know in the name of free trade. And so this is what's gotten most of the attention within that imperial historiography of framework. But I think what's missing oftentimes from that, though, is that the strongest critics, at least from the imperial metropole itself, were the most adamant free traders. These are the ones that actually brought about free trade in Britain. These are Richard Cobden and the Anti-Corn Law League overturning the protectionist tariffs on foreign grain that I alluded to earlier. They in Parliament are the biggest critics of this coercive enforcement of gunboat imperialism, of free trade imperialism, as it's sometimes referred to, saying that this is not what they intended, this is not what they meant. What they had was a non-coercive form that other countries would emulate and want to follow in Britain's footsteps once they see how successful this policy was. Not that it had to be forced at the barrel of a cannon's mouth. This is a different form of free trade than they had in mind. And so part of the story I try to show then is how this free trade movement becomes the opposition to these very same coercive free trade policies that others are implementing within Britain and sometimes elsewhere.
Professor, you show that this left-wing free trade current ran across many empires: British, American, Spanish, German, Dutch, Belgian, Italian, Russian, French, and Japanese. Were there important regional differences in how activists in, say, Britain versus Japan imagine a Pax Economica, or did they largely share the same global script?
I wasn't sure where that was going to, if how much of this. One of the things I was surprised by was how similar this story became, or at least those were the strings that I was most keen to pull on, as much as I wanted to be aware of the differences that were happening. So especially, and it probably makes sense within kind of transatlantic, Western European, U.S. context, the trajectory was often very similar, if not the same time frame. And that is connections to this abolitionist movement I mentioned earlier, and the women's suffrage movement. So a lot of these things were taking place in a transatlantic context, not necessarily in the Pacific region as it would later. So for most of those empires you mentioned, there was a remarkably similar story of this kind of connection between these left-wing civil rights and abolitionist movements becoming parts of this free trade movement that became part of the peace movement. So I say the probably the one outlier here in many ways, not just geographically though, is the Japanese Empire. So it's not to say that some of those elements weren't there. I would say within the Japanese Empire, rather than drawing on this earlier mid-19th century abolitionist and women's suffrage story that I tell in many of these ways, it's drawing much more, I think, clearly on the socialist internationalist dimensions of the story I tell, and it's drawing more on the Christian internationalist story, the Christian pacifism story that I'm telling. So so you have people like Katoku Shizui, who's a really fascinating Japanese imperial theorist writing around the same time that others are writing about similar issues of monopoly capitalism in the West. But he's doing it in his own way, as much as he's drawing on Marx and other Western thinkers. He's really a kind of ahead of the game on that. And there's Abe Isu is another one of the Japanese actors in this who becomes very important because of the way he molds together his Christian internationalism. Unitarianism is big in Japan around this time, at least within left-wing circles, as well as the international, the Young Men's Christian Association that he's a part of. And then he becomes closely aligned with the international cooperative movement, this moderate socialist alternative that grew out of Britain in the mid-19th century, became an international phenomenon that really took up steam in Japan by the early 20th century. And so you see a much closer alignment between socialist internationalism and Christian internationalism within the Japanese context than you do, I'd say, in those Western empires that you mentioned.
Professor, one of the striking ideas in your wider work is that what we often call the first stage of globalization was, for left-wing free traders, an iron age of enclosure and imperial competition. How does Pax Economica reinterpret that period from roughly 1840 to 1940, and why does that reframing matter for how we think about globalization today?
Yeah, and I suppose aside from kind of recovering this left-wing story that has been mostly told from a right-wing perspective, this is, I think, the other big kind of historiographical intervention, and this is mainly what chapter one is focused on, which is you can't understand why so many left-wing internationalists across the period of 1840 to 1940 subscribed to free trade as an economic essential element to a more peaceful and prosperous world without understanding the protectionist imperial world order in which they were pushing back against. So one of the things that you find in a lot of the history, like international relations scholarship as well as historical scholarship, is this common depiction of the decades, the 50 or so years, the 1840 to the First World War in particular, as a period of, as you say, first age of globalization, and as an era of laissez-faire and free markets run amok when, in fact, it's quite the opposite. And again, you can't, if, without understanding that protectionist imperial makeup of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you can't understand why anti-imperialist would be putting forward, well, what turns out to be something very different. And so recovering this protectionist form of globalization that we're kind of seeing some very eerie parallels coming into being today is essential to understanding for any of this to make sense. Uh, and so I think that's why reframing this is so crucial and I think has important lessons that maybe we can get into in more detail, or I can do of the kind of protectionist world order that we seem to be finding ourselves in, at least since in the last 10 years or so.
Professor, the book follows some unexpected figures, from feminist campaigners to Christian peace activists, who show free trade as a tool against empire, hunger, and militarism. Is there a particular character or movement whose story most surprised you or most changed your own understanding of the left's relationship to markets?
I think of all the groups I look at, I'd say the one that I found most surprising was the socialist side of this story. Um, I when I first came into this project many years ago now, with a clear sense of I thought it was going to be a capitalist story. I did not expect it to also be a socialist story. And so that to me was the most surprising. And I think probably because I was partly coming at it from Cold War blinders, so much of the way that we think of, or perhaps those who are old enough to have experienced the Cold War, this idea of a Western capitalist free market versus a Soviet style socialist closed market, right? And this is in many ways how I thought of, and I just assumed that that's how the story must have been amongst socialists, activists, and theorists going back to the mid 19th century with the rise of Marx and Engels. And so I think the most surprising thing was once I started pulling the strings, starting with Marx and Engels themselves, who actually came out very vocally and explicitly in favor of free trade. For them, it was much more pragmatic. They thought it was going to accelerate the capitalist system in a way that thus would get them closer to socialist revolution ultimately. Um, but it's the ways that Marx and Engels also saw protectionism as retrograde, as slowing down capitalism's development, and also as the way that they saw protectionism creating tensions between states and working against the countries that practice them. That part is going to be important to this next generation of socialist internationalists. Um, Including like Lenin and Karl Kautsky and Bernstein and the British Labour Party and indeed socialist internationalists quite diverse parts of the world. I mentioned Japan already, but I found quite a few examples in Latin America, like the Argentine Socialist Party. So anyway, this and the ways that the socialist internationalists actually started working together with their left-wing capitalist counterparts, who were also working towards a more peaceful and more integrated world system. It was a story of, at least for a while in the early 20th century, of socialist internationalists working alongside capitalists that really, really shocked me. Because again, this is not the story we think of when we think of these ideological and economic systems that are at loggerheads with one another. And so to find a very different story of camaraderie and partnership is fascinating.
Professor, you trace how the vision of a peaceful free trading order gradually evolved into support for supranational regulation and institutions, eventually foreshadowing bodies like the United Nations and European Union and the World Trade Organization. In your view, where did this left-wing globalized project succeed and where did it run around in the 20th century?
Yes, this was also a tricky one to trace out, although uh, uh, in part it makes sense the way that the left-wing actors and organizations in my book become so much more involved in these organizations that you mentioned. Of course, the League of Nations probably becomes the most important one, coming out of the First World War. And it's really in the First World War itself that you start to see a new generation of left-wing free traders um, who are becoming, I guess, cynical. The First World War is a prime example of how the warning signs were all there as far as they were concerned, that this nationalism, economic, political, ethnic, however you want it, all the nationalism that was so strong leading up to the First World War uh, um, essentially made the First World War inevitable. And so for them, it seemed clear that what are we going to do different once this great war ends? And for them, we have to somehow curtail the historical tendency of nations, if left to their own devices, to turn to populism, to turn to protectionism, to turn to self-sufficiency. How do we do this? We need to have some sort of supranational regulation. And so this is where you start getting the League of Nations and a variety of other international and supranational institutions that will then ultimately become something different after the Second World War, which is overseen. Again, the left-wing free traders in the book have a lot of say early on, at least, over the creation of what will become the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so forth. They very much had their feelers in there. So they understood this as a necessity. Here's two world wars, both in their view caused by extreme nationalism, leading to these global conflicts amongst the empires. Um, and so the only way to get around this is to create supranational regulatory bodies that can minimize this tendency. And in this way, they actually are, in many ways, in line with the neoliberal theorists from the right of this political spectrum. They in many ways they see eye to eye on this aspect. Where they don't see eye to eye is the role of democracy, the the willingness to give decolonizing states the space to find their own way and make their own decisions. Maybe they choose a different path. That's an area I think where we start to see some very big differences between the neoliberals of that period and the trends that those organizations are moving towards. And I think that's where it starts running aground. So once the left-wing free traders have much less of a voice in decision making in, say, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is the precursor to the World Trade Organization, or even the World Trade Organization itself, once it's founded in the 1990s. But across those decades between, say, the 1950s and the 1990s, um, they are very much on the outside looking in once again. And so they see these institutions that they help create moving more and more to this sort of a free trade ideology of the neoliberals that's much less sympathetic to democracy promotion, to environmental protections, to also just letting states have a bit more autonomy over at least short-term developmental policies that left-wing free traders became increasingly supportive of. So yeah, I think that's how I'd answer that.
Professor, at several points you highlight tensions and contradictions inside the left itself, between socialist view of markets, radical view of supranational authority, and peace activist view of power politics. What were the key fault lines that limited the realization of a true Pax Economica, and what do they teach us about coalition building today?
I'd say I would approach this maybe as two different kind of chronological points, because one of the things that I discovered was, say, with the socialists, it's not to say that all socialists around the world were supportive of this free trade vision that I explore here. There was actually the socialist nationalists who were sort of the opponents of the socialist internationalists, for example. Um, However, in this earlier period at least, and maybe there's some similar overlaps today, these socialist nationalists, socialism in one country kind of folks, they tended to be on the political right. You can even see this in the split within the German Social Democratic Party during the First World War period, where you've got the kind of left-wing anti-imperialist, internationalist wing that I'm more concerned with versus the right-wing part of the Social Democratic Party that became very supportive of the German Empire. And you can find similar ones with socialist nationalist organizations like the Fabian Society in Britain in the early 20th century. Um, so it's again, it comes down to this kind of nationalist versus social versus internationalist conflict that is key to this earlier story that ends up playing on interesting. The nationalists tend to be more on the right of the political spectrum versus the internationalists on the political left. Um, so to a certain extent, you can see that happening in more recent decades, but I think where it gets tricky is that, as we discussed, just a little while ago, when these supranational organizations like the World Trade Organization um, became less and less amenable and open to the demands coming from the decolonizing world, the global South, however we want to describe it. Uh, uh, then you start to see a disillusionment, increasing disillusionment within the left wing free trade movement, socialists, Christians, and so forth. Uh, it's not to say that they move inherently to, and this is where I think at first I thought it was going to. They didn't inherently move to a populist or nationalist or anti, or pro-protectionist um, position. Some did, but most really just wanted to create an alternative form of globalization, much more akin to this left-wing vision that grew from the mid 19th to the mid 20th centuries, and which they almost got in the late 1940s, early 1950s. Um, in other words, an alternative globalization, and you can see this with the fair trade movement, right? This idea of mostly this international movement of fair trade that grew out of around 1970, um, where buying more ethically sourced goods, even if it meant paying a little bit more. So it's a kind of an alternative free trade movement, I would say. Again, still focused on ethical uh, goods, and this ties into kind of you know not using slavery or exploitation of labor in ways that ties in very neatly with the earlier origin story of this left-wing movement. And the same with international cooperative movement. You can, most people probably have or still shop at the co-op down the corner. But those things, that global phenomenon that is the co-op, it is a part of this alternative globalization that left-wingers sought to realize. And so, in that sense, the fight, even though it's been muted, is still going on, even if people are unaware of this longer 150-ish year history of it.
Professor, you argue that later neoliberals appropriated some of the institutional and discursive groundwork laid by earlier left-wing globalists, even as they sideline those original egalitarian and anti-imperial aims. How did the meaning of free trade shift in the late 20th century? And what gets lost in our politics when that left-wing lineage is forgotten?
Hmm. Um, it does. I mean, even the terminology changes. So what happens is I mentioned that there was a similar. I think where the two movements align is where they see extreme nationalism and the tendency to turn towards seeking self-sufficiency as sort of the underlying cause of the two world wars. They definitely agree on that. They also, many of these neoliberals more on the right of the political spectrum and left-wing internationalists, they both are broadly supportive of and advocating for European union and European economic integration for similar reasons, not just prosperity, but also to make Europe so it doesn't go to war with itself again and help spark another global war. Um, yeah, but where it starts to differ is the role of democracy. The neoliberals become increasingly skeptical that democracies, if left to their own devices, will do what they need to do, and they particularly target left democracies. And you see this in the ways that things play out in Pinochet, in Chile, and many other parts of the globe across the latter half of the 20th century. Um, And of course, even within this is like say within the Christian peace movement, it sort of moves farther to the right during the Cold War and the militaristic kind of environment of the Cold War. And so you start seeing free trade. It becomes in the right wing version, it becomes known as free enterprise. There's some great work that's traced the kind of the coinage of free enterprise as a sort of a right wing variant of this. Um, and so I guess along the way though, we've lost that left-wing story that, if we look closely enough, is still all around us. One of the things I look at is kind of the left-wing anti-imperial suffragist origins of the board game Monopoly, and how this ties in to this global phenomenon that we look at, and our duty-free shops and airports. This is I contend in the tail end of the book is an outgrowth of this anti-imperial pacifistic dimension of free trade, duty-free goods being offered to. It starts in Ireland and to help raise Irish industries like Irish whiskey, but it becomes a global phenomenon in its own right. So I think one of the uses here is to try to remind people that this left-wing free trade movement and tradition that I look at here is still all around us if we know where to look.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. We are living through a renewed wave of economic nationalization, trade wars, and geopolitical rivalry. If a student or policymaker came to you and after reading Pax Economica and asked, what, if anything, can we salvage from this older left-wing free trade tradition for the 21st century? How would you answer?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I do try to end with a bit of hope. It was something I struggled with, like how do I end this? Because I was writing this, I started writing this just, or started researching this just as Donald Trump was elected for the first time on a very explicitly protectionist platform, and with we've seen it with Bolsonaro and Orban and other right-wing populists, and the ways that those have contributed, or Putin's kind of nationalistic war in Ukraine. Um, there were a variety of ways I could. There was a pessimistic way I could have come at this versus an optimistic. So I'll try to be optimistic here too. And that is, I guess, one of the things that was striking is this. It well, it took a while, but they did actually have surprising gains once we finally get to the mid 20th century, and this came apart. Yes, because they ended up having people in the White House and in this U.S. State Department, for example, in the 1930s and 40s, who were, they subscribed to these ideas, which was unusual in the U.S. context. Um, but this was a coalition that took decades to build up, and had some degrees of success before a variety of other things and controversies kind of took the steam out. The Cold War, the rise of the Cold War in the early, around 1950 is a big one. And so I think we face a similar issue today if you subscribe to this internationalist vision and think that a more interdependent world is preferable to a world of nations and dog eat dog kind of world order that people like Donald Trump kind of see it as a zero sum game where there's got to be a winner, there's got to be a loser. Um, and Greenland has raw materials that we need, so let's just take Greenland, right? This is very much of the mold that the left-wing free trade movement of the late 19th, early 20th century was explicitly working against. So I think if people realize that there's this longer history, or at least there's some interesting lessons that can be drawn perhaps to how peace and anti-imperial activists understood that globalization could be shaped into something peaceful, not necessarily something that had to be antagonistic and exacerbating tensions between nations. And again, it's not to say that story has completely disappeared. The remnants are still there. It's just I think would potentially just take a renewed belief that and an approach to reforming globalization into something more akin to how these left wing internationalists wanted it, and understanding that vision. And I'm not sure that you can without looking at this 150-year story that I tried to tell.
Listeners, as we wrap up this conversation, I want to thank you for joining us in revisiting the forgotten left-wing roots of free trade and globalism. Drawing on Pax Economica, we have seen how debates over trade, empire, and peace are not just abstract theories, but living questions that continue to shape our world today. I hope this discussion inspires you to look at the current arguments about globalization, economic nationalism, and international institutions with fresh historical perspective, and perhaps to imagine what a more just and genuinely peaceful Pax Economica might look like in our own time. Thank you once again, Professor Mark, for sharing your time, your expertise with us today. This has been a truly enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.